The security footage was only 47 minutes long. Damian Volkov watched it 3 times before he said a single word. On the screen, 3 of the most dangerous hired killers in the eastern seaboard moved through his home like shadows, trained, precise, utterly confident. They had disabled every alarm, neutralized every guard. They had walked into his mansion like men who already knew they'd won. And then the maid stepped out of the linen closet. Not a soldier, not a bodyguard. The woman who changed his bed sheets and scrubbed his kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, that woman stood between his enemies and everything he'd built. Damian pressed pause. He leaned forward in his chair, because in 20 years of running one of the most feared criminal organizations on the East Coast, no one had ever done what he was watching on that screen. Nobody sacrificed themselves for him. Nobody. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Stories like this one don't come around often, and I'd hate for you to miss what happens next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The night it all began, Elena Cross was on her knees scrubbing a grout line in the East Wing bathroom when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a surge, just nothing. Every light in the mansion dropped at exactly the same moment, and the security panel mounted beside the bathroom mirror went dark with a sound like a dying breath. Elena sat back on her heels. She'd worked the overnight shift at the Volkov estate for almost 2 years. In that time, she had learned the rhythms of the house the way a sailor learns the sea, not from studying it, but from surviving inside it. She knew that the backup generators kicked in within 11 seconds of any power failure. She knew the sound the HVAC made when it cycled through its overnight sequence. She knew which floorboards announced themselves under pressure and which ones swallowed footsteps entirely. The generators did not kick in. That was the first thing. The second thing was the silence. The estate employed 6 overnight security guards. At any given hour, at least 2 of them were moving through the corridors. She could track them by the low crackle of their radio static, the occasional exchange of bored conversation, the squeak of one particular guard's left boot. Armand, she thought his name was, though no one had ever introduced them properly. He walked the east corridor every 40 minutes. The corridor was silent. Elena did not move immediately. She crouched in the dark bathroom with her cleaning bucket between her knees, and she made herself breathe slowly, and she listened. 3 years of professional fighting had taught her that panic was just adrenaline with no direction. You didn't fight it, you redirected it. You let it sharpen your senses instead of scrambling them. So she listened. After approximately 90 seconds, she heard the sound she'd been dreading. Footsteps, but not the familiar ones. These were deliberate and careful in a way that Armand's boot squeaking never was. The footsteps of someone who had been trained to move silently and was doing a very good job of it. 2 sets, maybe 3. Moving in coordinated intervals, which meant they were communicating without speaking, which meant they were professionals. Elena set her scrub brush down very quietly inside the bucket. She stood up. The darkness in the bathroom was almost total. The blackout curtains on the window blocked even the ambient light from the grounds. She moved by memory, pressing her back against the wall beside the door, and waited. The footsteps passed the bathroom without pausing. East Wing, heading deeper into the house, heading toward Damian's private study. She told herself later that she made the decision in about 4 seconds. That felt true. It also felt like a lie, because the honest answer was that she had already started moving before the decision fully formed, her body making its own calculations while her conscious mind was still arguing. You could stay in the bathroom, lock the door, wait it out. She was already in the hallway. You don't owe these people anything. You clean their floors. You are a ghost to them. She was already tracking the sound of those careful footsteps. Elena, you left that life. You promised yourself you left that life. She had her bucket in her left hand and a full bottle of heavy-duty bleach in her right, and she was moving through the dark east corridor with her shoulder barely brushing the wall. The thing was, and this was the part she never told anyone, not even her sister, the part she was most ashamed of wasn't the fighting. It was that she didn't feel afraid. She felt something much more complicated than fear. Something that lived beneath her ribs and recognized this darkness, the way you recognize a childhood home you swore you'd never return to. She knew this territory. She just hadn't admitted it until now. The first man she found was not one of the intruders. He was face down on the floor of the corridor leading to the main security room, arms loose beside him, radio crushed under his chest where he'd fallen on it. Elena crouched beside him and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse. Strong and steady. Tranquilized, not killed. That was interesting. Professionals who didn't want a murder investigation, or professionals who had been given specific instructions. Either way, it told her something important. Whatever these men were after, it wasn't blood. She kept moving. The study was at the far end of the private wing, behind a reinforced door that required a 6-digit biometric code to open. Elena had cleaned the corridor outside that room 1,000 times, but had never been inside it. The staff understood without being told that certain rooms were not for them. She reached the corner of the private corridor and stopped. 2 of them. She could hear them now without any doubt. 2 voices, low and clipped, conversing in Russian so fast and flat that she caught only fragments. One of them was working the door panel. The other was positioned behind him, watching the corridor from the opposite direction, which meant his back was to Elena. She looked down at the cleaning supplies she was carrying and made a quick, unsentimental inventory. Bleach. A scrub brush with a solid wooden handle. A microfiber cloth. A spray bottle of floor cleaner that was approximately 40% isopropyl alcohol. A pair of heavy rubber gloves. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she put the rubber gloves on. What happened next was not elegant. She wanted to be clear about that in the private accounting she gave herself afterward. It was not the way she'd moved in the underground circuit, where there were rules and referees and some thin illusion of civilization stretched over the violence. This was ugly and close, and she made mistakes. The first man went down because she came around the corner fast and low and got the spray bottle directly into his eyes before he could process what was happening. It was big. She registered that immediately, bigger than she'd expected from the sound of his footsteps. And when she drove the heel of her palm up into his nose, the angle was wrong, and she felt it jar her wrist badly. He didn't go unconscious. He hit the wall and grabbed for her, got a fistful of her uniform, and she had to wrench sideways and let the fabric tear rather than fight his grip directly. His partner at the door panel was turning around. Elena was already moving. She used the first man's own momentum, let him pull her forward instead of back, and drove her knee up hard. That one landed correctly. He folded. The second man was faster than she expected and smarter. He didn't rush her, which meant he'd had actual training, which meant she needed to end this quickly before he assessed her properly. She threw the bleach bottle at his face, not to hit him, just to make him flinch, to make his hands come up. And when they did, she closed the distance in 2 steps and hit the side of his neck with the edge of her hand. He dropped like a sack of wet laundry. Elena stood in the corridor breathing through her nose and shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump. Her wrist hurt. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder. One of her knees was bleeding where she'd hit the floor during the struggle. She hadn't even noticed that happening. She did a slow count to 5. Then she noticed the 3rd set of footsteps, coming from the direction of the kitchen, the direction she'd come from. 3, she thought. There are 3 of them. The third man was different from the first 2. She understood this the moment she saw him, before he even saw her. He moved through the dark hallway with a looseness that the other 2 had lacked. Not careless, but comfortable, the way a person moves when they are genuinely not afraid. He was wearing a dark tactical vest and carrying something she didn't want to look at directly, and he was heading for the study door with the calm certainty of a man completing a task he'd done 100 times before. He was also between her and the only clear path back to the east wing. Elena pressed herself flat into an alcove beside a decorative shelf, one of the dozens of alcoves throughout the mansion that she'd come to think of as her landscape, the geography of invisibility, the places where a maid could disappear while the powerful people moved around her. She counted his steps. She did the math. She hated the math, because the math gave her about 4 seconds before he reached the door and discovered his unconscious colleagues. And 4 seconds was not enough time to do anything smart, so she did something stupid instead. "Excuse me," she said. The man stopped. There was a pause so complete that she could hear the rain starting against the mansion's high windows. "Excuse me," she said again, and stepped out of the alcove holding her scrub brush in one hand and her cleaning bucket in the other, and looked at the armed professional standing 10 feet away with the expression she had spent 2 years perfecting, the one that said, "I am not here. I am furniture. you have already forgotten me. It worked for almost 2 full seconds, which was exactly what she needed. I was the hardest of the three. She didn't win cleanly. There wasn't a version of this where she came out ahead on points. He got one arm around her throat, and she took an elbow to the ribs that she was fairly certain cracked something, and there was a stretch of about 20 seconds where she was not confident about the outcome. But she'd spent years fighting people who were bigger and stronger and had every physical advantage over her, and the thing she'd learned, the real thing, the lesson underneath all the technique, was that size only mattered as long as the fight lasted. Make it short, make it brutal. Don't let them use what they have. She drove the back of her skull into his face. He loosened his grip. She dropped her weight and twisted and got one of his wrists behind his back in a way that his wrist was not designed to accommodate. And when he tried to use his size to muscle out of it, she heard something pop, and his body made the decision she'd been waiting for it to make. He went down. Elena stood over him, breathing in ragged pulls. Her ribs were a specific, clarifying agony on her left side. Her wrist was worse than before. She had blood running down her shin from the knee she'd hit earlier, and she could feel a lump forming above her right ear where she'd hit the wall. At some point, she couldn't exactly remember. She looked at the three unconscious men arranged in various positions across the private corridor. She looked at the untouched vault door. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and her cleaning bucket between her feet, and she pressed her arm against her ribs, and she waited for Damian Volkov to come home. He arrived with 12 men at 3:47 in the morning. She heard them before she saw them, the convoy of vehicles, the crunch of gravel, the rapid footfalls of bodyguards spreading through the grounds. Then voices, urgent and overlapping, as someone found the first unconscious guard. Then shouting. Then the methodical sound of an organized search sweeping through the mansion room by room. They found her in the corridor, which was perhaps not the most dignified position she'd ever been in, sitting on the floor in a torn uniform with 3 zip-tied unconscious professionals around her, bleeding from several places, with a scrub brush across her knees. The man who stepped around the corner first was not Damian. He was one of the senior bodyguards, a heavy-shouldered man named Gregor, who had occasionally nodded at her in passing but had never spoken to her. He stopped when he saw her, and his hand went to his weapon before his brain caught up with what his eyes were seeing. "Don't," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. Gregor stared at her. He looked at the 3 men zip-tied on the floor. He looked at her cleaning bucket. He looked back at the 3 men. "I used their own zip ties," she felt compelled to add. "I found them in the tactical vest of the one by the door." Gregor said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Stay here," and stepped back around the corner. She heard him speaking rapidly in Russian. She didn't catch all of it, but she caught the tone. Damian Volkov appeared in the corridor approximately 4 minutes later. Elena had not been certain what she expected. She'd worked in his house for 22 months, and in that time she had seen him at a distance on perhaps 40 separate occasions. She knew his face from those distant observations, sharp and angular, with something behind the eyes that made people look away first. She knew his voice from overhearing conversations she was not meant to hear when she was cleaning rooms she was supposed to be invisible in. She knew from the way his household operated that he was the kind of person who controlled everything in his orbit without appearing to exert any effort at all. She did not know what he looked like when he was surprised. He was surprised now. He stood in the corridor and looked at the 3 incapacitated men, and then he looked at Elena sitting on the floor with her cleaning supplies, and his expression did something complicated that she didn't have a name for. He said something in Russian that she didn't understand. "I don't speak Russian," she said. "I know," he said. His English was accented but precise. "I said, are you injured?" She considered the question honestly. "Ribs, wrist, few cuts, nothing serious." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved over the corridor, taking in the scene with that same unhurried assessment she'd watched him apply to everything else in his world. "These men," he said finally, "you did this." It wasn't entirely a question, but it wasn't entirely a statement either. It occupied some third territory that she didn't have a word for. "Yes," she said. Another pause. "You are," he said slowly, "the woman who cleans the East Wing." "Among other wings," she said. Something moved across his face. She thought it might have been the beginning of something she wasn't expecting from him. "Why?" he said. Just that. One word. Flat and direct, and asking for more than it appeared to be asking. Elena thought about it. She looked at the vault door. Still closed, still untouched. She thought about the files inside it that she didn't know the contents of and had never asked about. She thought about the dozens of names she'd overheard over 22 months, accountants, drivers, kitchen staff, people who had no idea what the organization around them was truly built on, people who had rent payments and sick parents and children in school. They weren't coming for anyone, she said. They were coming for something. But the people who would have gotten hurt in the aftermath, those were real people. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You could have simply left the building, he said. Yes, she agreed. But you didn't. No. He was quiet again. The kind of quiet that felt like the surface of something very deep. What is your name? He said. And Elena Cross, who had worked in his house for 22 months without ever having a real conversation with the man who signed her paychecks, looked up at Damien Volkov and told him. And the way he repeated it back, carefully, like he was memorizing something he should have known a long time ago, was the moment, she realized much later, when everything changed. Not because he was powerful, not because she was impressed by him, or afraid of him, or drawn to him in any way she'd have admitted to at that particular moment on that particular floor, but because for the first time in years someone had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen something other than furniture. And she didn't know yet whether that was the beginning of something or just the end of the comfortable invisibility she'd spent so long building. What she did know was this. 3 men with serious training and expensive equipment had come into this house tonight, and they had been stopped by a woman with a bleach bottle and a scrub brush. And somewhere in the mansion, the security cameras had captured every second of it. The medic's name was Oleg, and he had the bedside manner of a man who had spent his career patching up people who deserved what had happened to them. He didn't ask Elena how she'd gotten hurt. He pressed along her ribcage with 2 fingers and watched her face instead of asking, reading the flinch, the held breath, the moment her jaw tightened against a sound she refused to make. 2 cracked, he said. Maybe 3. Hard to say without imaging. So nothing I can do about it. Rest. That's not an option right now. Oleg looked at her with the flat expression of a man who had heard that exact sentence from 100 different people in 100 different rooms and had stopped having feelings about it years ago. He wrapped her ribs without further comment, splinted her wrist, closed the gash on her knee with 3 strips of medical tape, and handed her 2 white pills that she didn't ask the name of. She took them anyway. Damien's people had moved the 3 unconscious men to separate rooms by the time Oleg finished with her. She could hear the household reorganizing itself through the walls, footsteps with purpose, doors opening and closing, Damien's voice somewhere below giving instructions in Russian that traveled through the floor as vibration rather than words. Gregor appeared in the doorway of the room they'd put her in. It was a guest room on the 2nd floor, not the staff quarters where she'd assumed they'd take her, but an actual guest room with actual furniture, which felt strange and slightly wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. He wants to see you, Gregor said. I assumed. She stood up. Her ribs announced themselves immediately. She kept her face neutral through it and followed Gregor into the hallway. Damien's private study looked nothing like she'd imagined it during the 2 years she'd cleaned the corridor outside its door. She had expected something deliberately intimidating, heavy wood, displayed weapons, the visual language of a man who needed the room to do some of the work of making people afraid. What she found instead was almost aggressively ordinary. Bookshelves without theater, a desk that had actual papers on it in actual stacks, a single lamp, 2 chairs facing each other with no desk between them, which was either a deliberate psychological choice or just how he preferred to sit. She suspected it was both. Damien was standing when she came in, which she hadn't expected. He was holding a glass of something amber but not drinking it, just holding it, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor. That same careful accounting, like he was updating a file. Sit, he said. I'm fine standing. Something shifted in his expression. Not irritation exactly, more like recalibration. Suit yourself, he said, and sat down in one of the chairs, which left her standing over him, which she suspected was also intentional. He gestured at the empty chair with his glass. Please. She sat. Her ribs made the transition unpleasant, and she managed it without reacting. The security system, he said. Walk me through what you noticed, from the beginning. So she did. She told him about the lights, about the generators. about the silence where Armand's footsteps should have been. She told him about the first man face down in the corridor and the pulse check, about the voices at the vault door, about the sequence of decisions she'd made that she was still not entirely sure she'd made consciously. Damien listened without interrupting. He didn't take notes. He didn't look away from her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You checked his pulse," he said. "Yes." "Before anything else?" "Yes." "Why?" She thought about it. Because if he was dead, the calculus was different. Dead meant someone wasn't being careful. Careful people are more predictable. Damien turned his glass slowly in his hand. Most people in your position would not have used the word calculus. Most people in my position would have hidden in the bathroom. Yes, he said, they would have. He set the glass down on the side table beside his chair. Who trained you? The question landed without preamble, and Elena felt the slight internal shift of someone who had been waiting for it. Nobody, she said. That's not true. It's the answer I have. The silence between them had texture to it. Not comfortable, not hostile, but loaded, like a room where something had recently been broken and the pieces hadn't been moved yet. Elena, he said, just her name, flat and precise. 3 men came into my house tonight, professionals. I pay substantial money to ensure that professionals cannot come into my house. You, a woman I have apparently been employing for nearly 2 years without ever having a real conversation with, you stopped them with cleaning supplies. He tilted his head slightly. I think you understand why I'm going to need more than nobody. I understand why you want it, she said. That's different. His jaw shifted slightly. A small movement. She filed it away. You're not afraid of me, he said. Should I be? Most people are. I noticed. She looked at him directly, which she could tell was not a thing that happened to him often enough that he'd gotten used to it. I'm not most people. That's apparently established at this point. For a moment, something crossed his face that she genuinely didn't expect. Not anger. Not the cold calculation she'd braced for. Something that might have been, if she was reading it correctly, the beginning of respect. It made her more careful, not less. Gregor came back into the room at the 40-minute mark, and the look he gave Damien over Elena's shoulder was the look of a man who had bad news and was deciding how to deliver it. They're awake, Gregor said. In English, which meant the information was meant for both of them. The big one's talking. Damien stood immediately, and the shift in him was physical. The loose quality he'd maintained during their conversation dropping away like a coat coming off. What was underneath it was not something Elena had a clean word for. Not rage exactly, more like focused voltage. Which room? He said. 3. The one with the broken wrist. Elena stood too, and Damien looked at her. You should rest, he said. You just spent 40 minutes asking me what I observed, she said. I might observe something useful. He looked at her for a moment, then he walked out of the room, which she took as permission and followed. The man with the broken wrist was named, apparently, nothing that he was willing to share. He was sitting in a chair in the middle of a room that had been cleared of everything else, and he was not restrained, which Elena thought was either a statement of confidence or a deliberate psychological choice. Probably both. His right wrist was swollen to roughly twice its normal size and held at a careful angle against his body. His face, when Damien walked in, did a complicated thing. Recognition, assessment, something that might have been fear but was working very hard to look like contempt. Damien pulled a chair from against the wall, set it directly in front of the man, and sat down. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at him with that same unhurried patience that Elena was beginning to understand was one of his actual weapons. The man lasted about 20 seconds. I'm not telling you anything, he said. His accent was Eastern European, but not Russian, something further west. You know how this works? I know how it works, Damien agreed. You know how it works. The question is whether you've actually thought through the part that comes after the part where you don't tell me anything. I know what comes after. Do you? Damien's voice was perfectly level. Because the man who hired you is going to hear about tonight either way. He's going to hear that his 3-man team was stopped by a cleaning woman with a bottle of bleach. And he's going to have to decide what that says about the quality of the people he employs. Something flickered behind the man's eyes. So, Damien said, you're going to sit here not telling me anything, And meanwhile, the person who sent you here is already deciding that you're a liability. You understand what I'm saying to you?" Elena stood near the wall and watched the man's face process this. It was not a fast process, but she could see it happening. The slow dissolution of the script he'd prepared, the point where he started actually thinking instead of just performing defiance. "The files," the man said finally. "That's all I know. Get the files on the drive in the vault. Deliver them." "To whom?" Silence. "The organization that hired you," Damien said. "Give me a name." "I don't have a name." "Everyone has a name." "I have a contact, a cutout. I give the drive to the cutout. I get paid. I don't ask questions." Damien studied him for a long moment. "The cutout. Where?" The man shook his head, and Elena could see that this particular refusal was real. Not defiance, but genuine absence of information. He actually didn't know, or knew only enough to be dangerous to himself if he said it. Damien stood up. He looked at the man for another few seconds. "Put him with the others," he said to Gregor. "Keep them separate. Nobody talks to them until I say." He walked out. Elena followed. In the corridor, Damien stopped and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched the tension work through his shoulders and settle. "The drive," she said. He turned. "Whatever is on that drive," she said. They knew exactly where to look. The vault location, the security layout, the shift schedule. Someone inside gave them that. The way his face changed told her he had already thought of this. But hearing it said aloud did something different to him. She watched it land, watched him absorb the specific weight of it. "Yes," he said. "So the problem isn't 3 men in a corridor," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. By 6 in the morning, the household had the particular exhausted quality of a place that had been awake too long and was running on adrenaline reserves that were beginning to run out." Elena was back in the guest room when Gregor knocked. "He wants the staff assembled. Main hall, 20 minutes. "Including me?" Gregor's expression did something careful. "Including everyone." She changed out of her torn uniform into the spare she kept in her staff locker, which felt almost absurdly normal given the circumstances, and made her way downstairs. The main hall held approximately 30 people: housekeeping, kitchen, 2 groundskeepers, the household manager, 3 administrative staff who worked Damien's legitimate business interests. They stood in clusters with the body language of people who had been pulled from sleep or interrupted in the middle of tasks, uncertain and not fully awake. Damien stood at the front of the room. He was looking at his own staff with an expression that Elena recognized, not from knowing him, but from her years in rooms where people had to assess threats they couldn't yet identify. He was looking at all of them and seeing, somewhere among the frightened and confused faces, the person who had let 3 killers into his house. "Last night," he said, and the room went very still. "This estate was targeted. Our security was compromised from the inside." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Someone in this house, or someone with access to information that only people in this house would have, provided our location, our schedule, and our vault access points to an outside party." A sound moved through the room, not panic, something more complicated. The sound of people who were frightened and were also, in varying proportions, wondering whether the person beside them was the one. Elena watched faces. The household manager, a thin woman named Mrs. Petrov, who ran the domestic staff with the efficiency of a military quartermaster, had gone the specific gray of someone managing shock. The head chef's jaw was tight. The youngest of the groundskeepers kept looking at the door. And then she saw it. Not in a dramatic way. Not a tell she could have pointed to and named, just a quality of stillness in one face among the 30 that was different from the stillness in the others. Everyone else was reacting, processing, fearing, calculating. This person was simply waiting. The way you wait when you already know how the story ends. Victor, one of the senior administrative staff, mid-40s with a careful gray mustache and the slightly formal posture of a man who had been given authority at some point and never fully let go of the physical performance of it. Elena looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she looked away, deliberately. Because looking directly at someone you've identified is the fastest way to tell them they've been identified. She needed to tell Damien, but she needed to do it without Victor knowing she'd noticed him and she needed to do it in the next few minutes before the assembly broke and Victor had time to act on whatever contingency he'd prepared. She worked her way to the edge of the group and put herself into Damien's peripheral line of sight. When his eyes moved to her, that unhurried sweep he made across the room every 30 seconds or so, she held his gaze for exactly long enough. He didn't change expression, didn't look where she'd been looking, just finished his address to the staff with the same controlled delivery, dismissed them, and then moved toward the corridor. When she fell into step behind him, Victor was already watching. She felt it on the back of her neck. In the corridor outside, she said it in 4 words. "Victor, administrative, he's waiting." Damien didn't slow his stride. "Waiting how?" he said. "Not afraid. Everyone else is afraid. He's waiting to see what happens next." They turned the corner, out of Victor's sightline. Damien stopped. For a moment he just stood there, and she could see him doing the internal accounting, not of whether he believed her, but of what it meant if she was right, and what it meant if she was wrong, and which error he could afford. "You're certain," he said. "No," she said. "But I've been in rooms where I had to make these calls fast, and I was right more than I was wrong." A beat. "How much more?" "Enough." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Gregor materialized from somewhere. The man had a talent for it. "Victor," Damien said, quietly, "conference room, and check his station before he gets there." Gregor didn't ask questions. He turned and disappeared. Elena stood in the corridor and felt the specific exhaustion of a body that has been running on emergency fuel for hours and is starting to present the bill. Her ribs were a low, persistent fire on her left side. Her wrist had stiffened inside the splint. She was aware distantly that she should sit down, that she should take whatever Oleg's white pills were for, that she should probably eat something. She was also aware that whatever was about to happen in the conference room was going to change the shape of what happened next. Not just for Victor, for her. Because she had now twice inserted herself into Damien Volkov's problems. The first time had been instinct and necessity. The second time, she'd done it consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was doing. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part she didn't examine in good lighting, she understood what that meant. She was no longer invisible. She had stepped out of the alcove, and she didn't know how to step back in. They found a burner phone in Victor's desk drawer. One number in the outgoing calls log, dialed repeatedly over the past 2 weeks. The last call had been made at 11:47 the previous night, approximately 90 minutes before the security system went dark. Victor sat in the conference room chair and looked at the phone on the table in front of him with the expression of a man who had already run the calculations and didn't like any of the outcomes. "That's not mine," he said. Nobody responded. He tried again. "I don't know how that got there." Damien sat across the table from him. Elena stood near the window, which she'd positioned herself at because it gave her Victor's profile and Damien's face simultaneously. Gregor stood near the door. "Victor," Damien said, "I've known you 11 years. Victor's composure slipped, just fractionally, just a seam showing. "Damien, don't." Flat, final. The word landed like a door closing. 11 years and you let 3 men into my house. You gave them the security rotation. You gave them the vault location. I had no choice. Everyone has a choice." Damien's voice hadn't risen a single degree. That was the thing about it that was so effective. It stayed exactly level while the content of what he was saying did all the work. Someone came to you, offered you something, or threatened you with something, and you chose them. Victor's hands, flat on the table, pressed harder. His knuckles went white. "They have my son," he said. The room absorbed this. Elena watched Damien's face for what she suspected was the first unguarded moment she'd witnessed from him since they'd met. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A small fracture in the surface. Something underneath it that was not what she would have predicted. Not rage. Something older than rage. "Where?" Damien said. "I don't know exactly. They told me if I told anyone, if the police got involved, if you found out and reacted." Victor's voice was doing something complicated, holding itself together through the kind of effort that left marks. "Alexei is 17 years old." Damien stood up. He walked to the window beside Elena and stood there looking out at the grounds, and she could feel the heat of what was happening inside him from 18 inches away. The absolute rigid control of a man holding something enormous down by sheer force of will. "How long?" he said. Victor knew what he was asking. How long had they had the boy? 3 weeks. Damien's jaw moved. "You should have told me," he said. "You can't tell me you would have—" 3 weeks, Victor. Something came into his voice then. Not a rise in volume, but a change in register, something rougher underneath the control. 3 weeks of my son being— He stopped, corrected himself. 3 weeks of your son being in their hands while you handed them everything they asked for, and you didn't come to me. They said you'd choose the files over Alexei. The silence that followed was a specific kind, the kind that exists right at the center of something being broken beyond the ability to be fixed. Elena watched Damien turn from the window. His face had closed again. Whatever had cracked open in it sealed back over so fast it was almost like it hadn't happened. "Find out who has the boy," he said to Gregor. "Everything Victor knows. Every detail, every contact, every drop location." He looked at Victor, and something passed between them that Elena couldn't fully read. Something long and complicated and layered under years she hadn't been present for. "And then we're going to get him back." Victor's face broke, just briefly, in a way that was almost unbearable to look at. Relief and shame fighting each other across the same square inch of expression. Elena looked away. She was looking at the burner phone still sitting on the table. One number, dialed repeatedly. Last call at 11:47 the previous night. Whoever was on the other end of that phone knew by now that the 3 men hadn't come back with the drive. They also knew, by now, that something had gone wrong, which meant they were already making new calculations. And somewhere in those new calculations, Elena Cross, the maid who had stopped their team and stayed in the house and talked to Damien Volkov for the better part of the night, Elena Cross was going to appear in those calculations as a variable that needed to be addressed. She picked up the phone. "Don't," Gregor said. "I'm not calling anyone." She turned it over in her hand, looked at the number. "I'm memorizing it." Gregor looked at Damien. Damien looked at Elena. She set the phone back down and looked at him directly. "Whatever comes next," she said, they already know there was a witness. They're going to want to know who I am." She kept her voice level and practical, the way she'd learned to be practical about things that frightened her. "Which means it's not safe for me to leave." "No," Damien said, "it's not. And I'm not staying here as your possession. I know. I'm not your employee anymore either. That arrangement is finished." He held her gaze. "What arrangement are you proposing?" Elena thought about it. She thought about her apartment, which was technically within reach but might as well have been on another continent now. She thought about her sister Maya, in her residency program, who called every Sunday and who Elena had protected from every dangerous thing in her life since they were children. She thought about the small, careful world she had built specifically because it couldn't be touched. It had been touched. She was already past the point of no return. She'd crossed it sometime around the moment she'd stepped out of that alcove and said, "Excuse me," to a man with a weapon. "Equal footing," she said. "I help you, you help me. When this is done, I'm out. Clean. No obligations." Damien studied her. "And your sister stays out of this entirely," she added. That one landed with more weight than she intended. She watched him register it, the fact that she had someone to protect, that she'd volunteered the information, that she was asking him to honor it. "You have my word," he said. She didn't know yet whether his word meant anything, but she was going to find out, because the phone on the table between them was already ringing. Nobody moved. The phone sat in the middle of the conference table and rang with the particular flat tone of a prepaid burner. No melody, no personality, just a repeated electronic pulse that filled the room like a second heartbeat. Victor's hands, still flat on the table, had gone completely rigid. Gregor looked at Damien. Damien looked at Elena. She looked at the phone. "Answer it," she said. If I answer it—" Victor started. "Not you." Elena picked it up and held it toward Damien. "You. Don't say anything. Let them talk first." Damien took the phone from her hand. Their fingers didn't touch, but it was close. He looked at the screen. The same number, the one she'd memorized, calling back what it assumed was its own asset. He accepted the call and held the phone to his ear and said nothing. 3 seconds of silence on the other end. Then a voice. Male, measured, with an accent that was deliberately flattened. The accent of someone who had worked to remove identifying markers from their speech, the way you'd sand a serial number off a weapon. The package wasn't delivered, the voice said. I need a status update. Damien said nothing. Another pause. Longer this time. Victor. Not a question, a prompt. The voice of someone accustomed to being answered. Damien covered the microphone with his thumb and looked at Victor. Something passed between them. An instruction that didn't need words. Victor understood it, and Elena could see the exact moment he decided, the way a man decides when the alternatives have all been removed. Victor leaned forward. Damien held the phone toward him. There was a complication, Victor said. His voice was remarkably steady, which told Elena something about what this man had been living with for 3 weeks. The team was intercepted. Silence on the other end. The specific silence of someone who is recalculating rather than reacting. Intercepted by whom? Victor looked at Damien. Damien gave the smallest possible nod. Additional security, Victor said. Someone they didn't account for. Is the drive recovered? No. Another silence. Longer. Victor. The voice had changed register. Not louder. Something more controlled than loud. You understand what a failure of this scale means for our arrangement. Victor's jaw tightened. You said Alexei, is comfortable, for now. A pause that was designed to be uncomfortable. I'll be in touch. The line went dead. Damien lowered the phone. He set it on the table with the careful precision of a man handling something he wanted to throw. He looked at the wall for a moment, and Elena watched him absorb the phone call the way you absorb a punch. Not flinching from it, just processing the impact and filing it. He didn't ask where the 3 men are, Elena said. Damien looked at her. He already knows they failed, she said. He called to confirm Victor's position. He wanted to know if Victor had been exposed. She looked at the phone. He was testing, not asking, Gregor said from near the door, which means he has another line into the house. The word another did what it was supposed to do. Victor's head came up. Damien went very still. Victor, Damien said slowly. Who else did they approach? Victor's face did something complicated. I don't know. Think carefully before you say that again. I genuinely don't know, Damien. They came to me directly. They didn't tell me if there were others. That's how they operate. Compartmentalized. Nobody knows the other pieces. Elena was already looking at the room differently. The conference room had one door which Gregor was standing near. 2 windows. A phone console on the side table that was connected to the household internal line. She was doing the math she'd been doing since she stepped out of that alcove. The math of a space, who was in it, who could hear what was said inside it. We need to move, she said. Both men looked at her. Whoever else they have in the house heard Victor get pulled into this room, heard Gregor go to his desk. Depending on how this place is laid out, they may have heard enough to know Victor's been made. She stood up from the windowsill. We've been sitting in this room for 20 minutes. That's 20 minutes of information we've handed to someone we can't identify. Damien stood. He said something to Gregor in Russian, short and decisive. Gregor reached under the conference table and disconnected the internal phone line from the wall. They moved to a room Elena had never been in, a small space behind the estate's primary security office that turned out to be something between a safe room and a war room, with no windows and no internal phone connections, and a door that locked from the inside with a manual bolt. 4 people. Damien, Gregor, Elena. Victor, whose status had shifted in the past hour from suspect to reluctant asset, and who wore the expression of a man who understood exactly how conditional that shift was. Damien unrolled something on the table, a hand-drawn layout of the estate, done in pencil on heavy paper, the kind of document that had been updated multiple times over years. He put his finger on the conference room they'd just left. Everyone in the house right now, he said to Gregor. Full list. How many do we actually trust? Gregor was quiet for a moment. 12, maybe 14. Out of 30? Out of 30. Damien looked at the map. The others go to the secondary property, today. Give them 2 days' pay and tell them it's maintenance work on the estate. They'll be called back. He looked at Gregor. Do it in a way that doesn't look like what it is. Gregor nodded and left the room, and Elena noticed that Damien waited until the bolt slid home before he continued. The drive, he said. He looked at Victor. What do they want with it? Victor shook his head. I don't know what's on it. You know what's on it. I know categories, personnel files, financial records, connections between the organization and certain... He stopped, started again. Certain political figures in 3 states. The room was quiet. How did they know what was on it? Damien said. Someone told them. Who? I don't know. Victor. The patience in Damien's voice had a floor to it, and they were getting close to it. Someone told an outside organization that a specific encrypted drive in a specific vault, in this specific house, contains information about political connections. That is not information you find through general research. Someone read that drive or was present when its contents were discussed, or was given that information deliberately. He paused. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to understand that Alexei's situation improves significantly if you help me identify this person. Who told them what was on that drive? Victor was quiet for a long time, longer than felt comfortable. I heard a name, he said finally. 3 weeks ago, when they first contacted me, before they told me about Alexei. They were trying to establish credibility, showing me they had real access, real information. They mentioned a name, someone inside the organization who had been feeding them information for over a year. Name, Damien said. Victor looked at him. Costa. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences in that room. It had weight to it, a specific personal weight that pressed down on the walls. Elena didn't know the name, but she watched Damien's face go through something she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the controlled processing of new information, not the rapid tactical calculation. Something slower, something that had nothing tactical in it at all. My uncle's man, Damien said. It wasn't a question. Victor nodded. Damien turned away from the table. He stood facing the wall with his back to both of them, and Elena watched the set of his shoulders and understood that she was seeing something very few people were ever positioned to see. Damien Volkov absorbing a truth that reorganized everything he thought he knew, and doing it with 2 witnesses present because the situation hadn't given him the luxury of doing it alone. How long? He said to the wall. They said over a year. What did he give them? I don't know the specifics, routes, contacts, possibly financial structures. Victor's voice dropped. Damien, Costa has been inside everything for 6 years. If he's been feeding them for over a year... I know, Damien said. His voice had gone flat in a way that was more frightening than any of the controlled precision that had preceded it. I know what it means. Elena looked at the map on the table. She looked at the estate layout, the rooms, the corridors she'd spent 2 years learning. She thought about the secondary network this unknown organization had just demonstrated. 3 elite professionals, inside access, a compromised handler, and now a revelation about a mole embedded at the highest level of Damien's operation for over a year. She thought about the phone call, the voice that had called to test Victor's status. She thought about Alexei, 17 years old, somewhere she couldn't identify. She thought about her sister Maya, who called every Sunday. And she felt the specific cold clarity of someone who has just understood that the problem is significantly larger than the problem they agreed to help with. They had 4 hours of relative quiet. Not peace, quiet. The kind that exists when a storm is reorganizing itself rather than stopping. Elena used the time to sleep, which was a practical decision rather than an emotional one. She'd been awake for nearly 20 hours. Cracked ribs and a damaged wrist were manageable on adrenaline. They became liabilities on a body running on nothing. She found a couch in an interior room that Damien's people had swept and cleared, and she lay down with her arm across her ribs and was unconscious in under 4 minutes. She woke up to Gregor's hand on her shoulder and the particular quality of silence that precedes something breaking. How long? She said. 2 hours. He stepped back. You need to come. She followed him through corridors that felt different from how they'd felt at 3 in the morning. Less dark, but not safer. The familiar geography now carrying the specific unease of a place where she no longer knew who else was in it. Damien was in the secure room. He was on a call. Not the burner phone, his own phone, speaking Russian in a tone she'd come to recognize as the one he used when he was getting information he didn't want. He ended the call when she came in. Costa knows Victor's been made, he said. Elena sat down. How? He was watching, or someone he has in the house was watching. Damien set his phone on the table. He's been calling in loyalties. People inside my operation who owe him, who he's been building relationships with for years. By tonight, I won't know with certainty which of my people are actually my people. Where is he now? That's the problem. Damien looked at her directly. He's gone. Pulled out this morning. Nobody's seen him at any of the usual locations. Elena processed this. He's positioning. Yes. For what? Damien was quiet for a moment. Costa is my father's younger brother. He's been part of this organization longer than I've been alive. He knows every structure, every leverage point, every external relationship. He paused. He's not trying to sell information to a competitor. He's been building a case for a takeover. The competitor organization isn't buying access to my files. They're financing Costa's move against me, in exchange for a cut of what comes after. Elena looked at the map still spread on the table, at the estate layout, at the property as a shape, the walls, the gates, the grounds. How long do we have? She said. I don't know. Hours. Maybe less. He looked at her. I need to move the drive. If I can get it to a secure external location, something Costa doesn't know about, something off the network he's had access to, I can use what's on it as leverage. The political connections, the financial records. If Costa moves against me and I can surface that material through the right channels, it doesn't just neutralize him. It ends the whole structure he's trying to take over. Nobody survives what's on that drive going public. Elena looked at him. You'd burn your own organization. I'd control the burn, he said. There's a difference. She thought about that. About Victor's son somewhere in a house she couldn't identify. About a voice on a burner phone with no accent left in it. About a man named Costa who had spent 6 years earning trust he was planning to spend on a single large transaction. Where's the external location? She said. That's what I need to establish, tonight. With what resources? Whatever I have left that I'm certain of. He paused. Which at this particular moment is approximately 4 people, one of whom is you. Elena looked at her hands. The splinted wrist. The knuckles that were still slightly swollen. She thought about the math she'd done in the corridor on the night it started. The math of 4 seconds and not enough options. And recognized that she was in a version of that same equation again, but with longer odds and higher stakes and considerably more fatigue. I need something from you, she said. Name it. Maya, my sister. She's at St. Clement's doing her residency. She has Sunday rounds, which means she's in the hospital today. I need someone I trust. She paused, because the word trust had a new weight in it now, in this room, after the last several hours. Someone you trust, which I understand is a narrowing pool, to go to that hospital and make sure she stays inside it. Don't tell her anything. Just make sure she's somewhere with security. Damien looked at her for a moment. Gregor. Gregor near the door. I'll go myself. That leaves us 3 people, Elena said. Yes, Damien said. For moving a drive out of a compromised house past a network we can't fully map, to a location that doesn't exist yet, while an unknown number of Costa's people watch the property. Yes. She breathed through it. The ribs on her left side protested the depth of the breath, and she reduced it to something shallower. All right, she said. The plan was not elegant. Elena made peace with that quickly, because elegant plans required resources and time, and she had neither. What she had was the estate layout memorized to a degree that Costa's network probably hadn't accounted for, because the people who memorize the floor plan of a house are the people who clean it, not the people who run it. She knew which external walls backed against which hedgerows. She knew which door in the basement hadn't been on a functioning alarm circuit for the past 3 months, because she'd reported the malfunction to the household manager in October, and it still hadn't been fixed. She knew the 7-minute gap between the groundskeeper's last sweep of the east garden and the security camera rotation on the south perimeter. She laid it out for Damien in about 4 minutes. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was how he operated when he was actually paying attention. The drive, she said. Where is it physically? Still in the vault. Can you get to the vault without going through the main corridor? He was quiet for a moment. Service tunnel. From the mechanical room in the basement. It comes up through the floor of the storage room adjacent to the study. You've used it before. Once, a long time ago. Does Costa know about it? A pause that told her he was genuinely uncertain. I don't know. Assume yes, she said. We don't go through the tunnel. Then how, I go through the main corridor, she said, alone. Damien looked at her. I'm the maid, she said simply. I have always gone through the main corridor. If anyone in this house is watching, a maid moving through the East Wing corridor is the least interesting thing they could see. It's exactly what they've been not seeing for 2 years. He was quiet. You get to the vehicle, she said, the one that isn't in the main garage. You said there was a secondary car in the groundskeeper's outbuilding. Get to it. Victor comes with you. He's not safe here, and he's more useful with you than without. I'll meet you at the East Garden door in... She looked at the clock on the wall. 18 minutes. Elena, I've done harder things in this building. Last night, if you need a recent reference. Something moved in his jaw. Not agreement exactly. More like the recognition that argument was going to cost more than it was worth. 14 minutes, he said. Not 18. 15. He looked at her. The look lasted about 2 seconds longer than functional. 15, he said. She moved through the East Wing with her cleaning caddy in one hand and her face arranged in the expression she'd spent 2 years perfecting. The expression that said, I am not here. I have never been here. You will not remember me in 4 seconds. 2 of Damien's staff passed her in the corridor. Neither looked at her directly. She kept her pace exactly the same as it always was. Not hurrying, not dawdling, the deliberate, moderate pace of someone with a full roster of tasks and a specific schedule. She turned the corner into the private wing. The corridor was empty. She reached the study door and entered the access code that Damien had given her 6 minutes ago in the secure room, spoken once and not repeated, and she understood that him giving it to her was a form of trust she had no clean name for. The vault was in the far wall behind a panel that looked like a section of built-in shelving. She found it, opened it with the secondary code he'd also given her, and looked at the interior. The drive was small, smaller than she'd expected. A matte black rectangle about the size of a thumb drive, but thicker, with a single indicator light that glowed faint green. She picked it up and put it in her uniform pocket. She was about to close the vault when she heard the study door open behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She closed the panel over the vault. She turned around slowly, with the cleaning caddy still in her hand, with her face arranged in the expression. The man standing in the doorway was not one of the people she'd catalogued in the past 12 hours. He was somewhere in his late 50s, with the compact, settled build of a man who had been physical in his youth and had never entirely lost the habit. I was dressed in clothes that were slightly too formal for the early morning, as if he'd come from somewhere else and hadn't changed. He had gray at his temples and in his neatly kept beard, and he was looking at Elena Cross with the expression of a man who already knows exactly what he's just walked in on. She understood in the same moment who he was, before he said anything, because of what the expression said. The particular quality of someone looking at a problem they've already categorized and are now deciding how to address. This was Costa. He had not come in through the front. He was already inside. The maid, he said. His English was more accented than Damien's, but equally precise. He looked at her caddy, at her hands, at the vault panel, now closed. You're not the maid. Elena looked back at him. She was calculating. The distance to the door which he was standing in, the window, which was 4 meters to her left, the cleaning caddy, which contained nothing she hadn't already inventoried in her mind, her wrist, which was splinted and would not perform at full capacity, her ribs, which had been a persistent fire for the past several hours, and were about to be asked to do things ribs in their condition were not designed to do. The math was bad. I cleaned the East Wing, she said, and the private wing on request. What is in your pocket? Costa said. She didn't answer. He stepped fully into the room, and she saw now that he was not alone. There was a second figure behind him, staying in the corridor. Male, younger, large in the way that was a professional credential rather than a personal characteristic. Costa moved toward her with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has spent decades being the person in the room that other people move away from. He stopped about 4 feet from her and looked at her face the way you look at something you're deciding how to dismantle. I've been watching the cameras for the past hour, he said. I've watched my nephew go to a room he thinks I don't know about. I've watched his bodyguard leave the property. He tilted his head slightly. I've been watching you, of course, since last night. A pause. You're very good, but you're not invisible. Elena felt the cold settle into her chest. Give me the drive, he said, and you'll walk out of this house. She looked at him. She thought about Damien at the groundskeeper's outbuilding right now, waiting. 15 minutes. She had used 11 of them. She thought about Gregor heading to St. Clement's, about Maya in the hospital, safe in her Sunday rounds. She thought about the voice on the burner phone, the one that had been flattened of all its identifying markers. And she listened to Costa's voice and heard, beneath the accent, beneath the precision, the same deliberate flatness. The call hadn't been made by a cutout. The call had been made by Costa himself. She'd memorized the number. You called the phone this morning, she said. He looked at her without confirming or denying, which was its own answer. You have Victor's son, she said. Something in his face shifted. Not guilt. Costa was not a man who experienced guilt as a recognizable sensation. Something more like the adjustment a chess player makes when an opposing piece does something unexpected. The drive, he said. His voice had lost its conversational quality. Now. Elena looked at the distance between them. She looked at the man in the corridor behind him. She looked at her splinted wrist and felt the reality of her ribs with a clarity that was almost meditative. And she understood, standing in that room with the drive in her pocket and no clean exit and 4 minutes left on the clock, that there was no version of this moment that didn't require her to become something she had spent years trying not to be again. Not the careful woman who stayed invisible. Not the person who weighed options and calculated exits. The person she'd been before. The one she'd buried. The one who already knew, even as Costa was reaching toward her, that the distance between them was wrong for what he was expecting, and exactly right for what she was. She moved first. That was the thing Costa hadn't accounted for. That she would move before he finished reaching, before the gesture completed itself, before the moment resolved into what he expected it to resolve into. He was accustomed to being the person who initiated. He was accustomed to the half-second of freezing that comes over people when a man like him extends his hand toward something they're holding. Elena didn't freeze. She dropped the cleaning caddy directly between them, not throwing it, just releasing it, letting gravity do the work. And the clatter of it hitting the hardwood was loud enough to pull the man in the corridor half a step forward, which was the only thing she needed. She was already moving left. Not toward the door, which was what Costa expected, which was why he'd positioned himself there. Toward the window. Not to go through it, but to use the 4 meters of distance it gave her, the room's geography suddenly working in her favor rather than against it. Costa was fast for his age. She registered that immediately and filed it as a relevant fact. He moved after her without the half-second delay she'd hoped for, and his hand caught the back of her uniform at the shoulder. The same uniform that had torn on her first night, the same spot. And she did the same thing she'd done then. Let it tear. Went with the momentum instead of against it, twisted inside his grip, and hit his forearm with the heel of her splinted hand. The splint was rigid fiberglass and medical tape. It was not designed to be used as a striking surface. The impact sent a white flare up her arm that temporarily eliminated coherent thought on that side of her body. She hit him anyway. His grip broke. She got 2 meters of separation and put the desk between them, and they stood there for a moment in the particular suspended stillness of two people resetting. Costa looked at his forearm. He looked at her. He looked at the splint. Cracked ribs and a damaged wrist, he said. Something in his voice was different now. Not angry, almost admiring in the way that made it worse. And you're still making this difficult. Give me something easier to do, she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended because the impact had reactivated everything her ribs had been complaining about all morning. The man from the corridor was inside the room now, larger up close than he'd appeared from a distance, the kind of large that said professional history, not gym membership. He positioned himself to her right, which was the smart move, and Costa moved left, which was also the smart move, and she understood that she was now in a geometry problem where both variables were moving simultaneously, and she had 2 functioning limbs out of 4. She looked at the window to her left. She calculated. She picked up the desk lamp with her left hand, cord still attached, which she ripped from the wall as she lifted it, and threw it at the larger man's head. He ducked, which cost him a step, which was not enough to matter, but was something. Costa came around the desk. She met him inside the reach he was expecting. too close for him to use his full arm extension, pressing the engagement into the range where size advantages compressed in speed was what remained. She caught his wrist with her left hand and pulled rather than resisted, redirecting his momentum, and got one good hit with her left elbow into the side of his jaw. His head snapped sideways. He stayed up. Older than she'd estimated, she revised immediately, and more conditioned than he looked. The jaw absorbed it, and he turned into it rather than away, which was a trained response, and she didn't have time to be surprised by it. The large man's arm came around her from behind. She went low, dropping her weight suddenly, the way she'd learned to do it in the circuit when people bigger than her got hold of her. And his grip slid from her torso to her shoulders, and she kept dropping until she was almost at floor level and drove her elbow back into his knee. The sound he made was involuntary. His grip came off entirely. She came back up and she was breathing hard now, the ribs turning every inhale into a specific negotiation, and she had maybe 90 seconds of this left before her body started making decisions she hadn't authorized. 3 minutes on the clock. Maybe less. She needed to get out of this room. The window was old. The estate was old. And the windows in the private study were original, with the slightly warped frames of things that had been through decades of temperature changes. Elena knew this window. She had cleaned it approximately 40 times. She knew that the latch required upward pressure before it would turn, and that the frame stuck at the bottom left corner and needed to be pushed outward at an angle. She had 20 feet between her and it, and 2 men between her and 20 feet. She looked at the desk, at the lamp cord still trailing from her left hand, at Costa, who was rubbing his jaw and reassessing, at the larger man, who was favoring his right knee but who was not, frustratingly, incapacitated by it. She ran directly at Costa. It was the thing he expected least, which was why she did it. Because when you're running toward the threat's body instinctively prepares for impact, and preparation for impact is a form of stillness. And stillness is what she needed for the next 3 seconds. She feinted at him, pulled up just short, made his arms come up, and ducked under them and was past him, at the window, both hands on the frame before the larger man had fully processed the direction change. Upward pressure on the latch. Turn. Push at the bottom left corner with her hip because her wrist couldn't do it. The window came open. Cold air hit her face. Then Costa's hand was in her hair. It was a brutal, graceless grip, the kind that doesn't care about technique, just result, and he yanked her backward and she cried out. The first sound she'd made that wasn't deliberate, pulled out of her by the specific intersection of the scalp pain and the rib impact as her back hit his chest. "Enough," he said, directly into her ear. Not loud. "That's enough." She was breathing in shallow pulls, sweat on her face. The ribs were beyond negotiating now. They were simply failing at their job of not broadcasting pain with every function her body tried to perform. The drive was still in her pocket. "The drive," Costa said, "and this stops." She looked at the open window, cold air moving through it. Dawn coming up gray over the grounds, 14 minutes since she'd left the secure room. She thought about Damien at the east garden door. She thought about Victor beside him. She thought about the shape of the grounds in her memory, the south perimeter, the groundskeeper's outbuilding, the route between here and there. She went limp. Not dramatically, not a fake faint, just reduced. Let the resistance leave her body the way tension leaves a muscle when you deliberately release it, and felt Costa's grip adjust in response, the automatic recalibration of someone holding dead weight instead of active resistance. It bought her half a second. She brought her left elbow back hard into his solar plexus, and when his grip on her hair released by 3 inches, she turned into it, into the pain, letting her head take what the turn cost her, and got her left hand on his wrist, and did the same thing she'd done to the man in the corridor on her first night. The angle was wrong because of the splint. She knew the angle was wrong before it resolved. She compensated by using her body weight instead of her arm strength, dropping suddenly and rotating, and what she got wasn't a clean break, but it was enough. His wrist folded in a direction it resisted, and his body made the involuntary decision to follow it. He went down to one knee. She was already at the window. She went through it. The drop on the other side was 6 feet onto what had once been a flower bed and was now hard November ground. She hit it wrong, couldn't control the landing with one arm compromised, came down on her left side instead of both feet, and the impact went through her ribs like someone had reached in and squeezed them directly. She did not stop. She pushed up off the ground with her left hand and ran. The east garden was 200 meters to the right along the exterior wall. The route went past two ground-floor windows, through a gap in the hedgerow that she'd walked past approximately 300 times in 2 years of pulling weeds and hauling clippings without anyone noticing her, and came out at the iron-framed door set into the East Garden's perimeter wall. She ran it in just under 2 minutes. She didn't know if Costa came through the window after her. She could hear, distantly, the sound of voices inside the house. Raised voices, more than two, which meant the situation inside had shifted while she was occupied in the study. But she didn't look back. Looking back cost time. She had no time. Damien was at the door. He saw her coming, saw the way she was running, the left arm held tight against her side, the breathing she couldn't fully control. And he came through the door toward her before she reached it. "The drive," she started. "I have eyes," he said. His hands went to her arms to steady her, and she felt him register the state of her. The sweat, the new blood on her lips she hadn't noticed until now, the way she was breathing, and his jaw went tight in a way she filed away for later, when later existed. "Did you get it?" She reached into her pocket with her left hand and held it up. He took it. For a moment he just held it, and she watched something move through his face that she didn't have a name for. "Costa is in the house," she said. "He's got at least one man with him. He's been watching the cameras. He knows about the secure room. He knows you pulled Victor out of the staff meeting." She breathed. "He was already inside when I got to the vault. He came in through a way I didn't know about." "The tunnel," Damien said. "You said you didn't know if he knew about it." "I was wrong." He said it without hesitation, which she noted. "Victor." Victor appeared from behind the outbuilding, looking like a man who had aged a decade in the past several hours. He looked at Elena, and his face did something that might have been gratitude if it wasn't so saturated with guilt. "The car," Damien said. The groundskeeper's outbuilding held a vehicle that was not registered to the estate, an older model sedan, dark blue, forgettable, with plates from a different state. Damien drove. Victor sat in the back. Elena took the passenger seat because the front seat reclined and her ribs needed the recline. They were through the service entrance and onto the secondary road in under 4 minutes. Elena watched the side mirror until the estate's outer wall disappeared from view. "Where are we going?" Victor said from the back. "Safe house," Damien said. "Costa knows the safe houses." "Not this one." Victor was quiet. Elena looked at Damien's hands on the wheel, relaxed, deliberate. The hands of someone who had been in moving vehicles at bad hours and difficult circumstances, enough times that the muscle memory handled the driving while the mind handled everything else. "He called the burner phone himself," she said. "This morning. I recognized his voice against the call from the conference room." Damien didn't look at her. "I know. He has Victor's son." "I know that too." "What's the plan for Alexei?" Damien was quiet for a moment. "Gregor is working a locate. He had contacts before he went to the hospital, people who track movement, safe houses, off-book properties in the area." He paused. "Costa would keep the boy close. He's a leverage point, not a trophy. You keep leverage where you can get to it quickly." "That narrows the location." "Yes." Elena looked at the road ahead. Dawn had broken fully now, gray and flat, the kind of November morning that didn't offer much in terms of visibility or comfort. Her ribs had settled into a constant register somewhere between bad and worse, and she was doing the things she'd learned to do in the years when bad and worse were her standard operating range, cataloging the pain, giving it a number, and putting the number in a drawer. The number was high. She put it in the drawer. "The drive," she said. "What's the play?" Damien reached inside his jacket without taking his eyes off the road and held the drive toward her. She took it. "I need to get it to someone who can host the material externally," he said. "Outside the organization's reach, outside Costa's reach. Someone with enough standing that when the contents come out, they come out in a way that's verifiable and attributable." "A journalist," she said. "A specific journalist. Someone I've kept at arm's length for years because I understood that the moment I handed them something real, I crossed a line I couldn't come back from." He paused. "I'm ready to cross it." Elena turned the drive over in her left hand, thought about what was on it, the personnel files, the financial structures, the political connections in 3 states, thought about what it meant for those political connections to become public, thought about the secondary damage, the people caught in the blast radius who hadn't built anything or betrayed anyone, who had just been in proximity to power because proximity was what they had access to. There will be collateral, she said. Yes. People who didn't choose this. Some. Not as many as if Costa takes control and runs this organization the way he intends to run it. He said it without inflection, like a person reading a damage assessment. I've done the math. What's the math? Limited damage now versus unlimited damage over the next decade. He paused. I'm not telling you it's clean. I'm telling you it's the least bad option I have left. Elena looked at the drive. She thought about a version of this where she'd stayed in the bathroom. She put that thought in the drawer too. The safe house was a 40-minute drive east, a property that didn't appear in any document connected to Damien's name, purchased through 3 intermediary entities over the course of 7 years in a deliberate slow burn of untraceable acquisition. A 2-story house on a residential street, indistinguishable from its neighbors, with nothing outside to suggest it was anything other than what it looked like. Elena stood in the small kitchen while Damien established contact with his journalist, and Victor sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he wasn't drinking, staring at the surface of the table like it contained information. She cleaned the blood off her lip with a damp cloth, looked at herself in the small mirror above the kitchen sink for about 3 seconds, and then looked away, because what she saw in it wasn't particularly useful. Her phone buzzed. She had forgotten she had her phone. It had been in her uniform pocket the entire time, and the specific chaos of the past several hours had pushed it entirely from her awareness. She pulled it out now. Gregor. A text message, not a call. Sister is secure. Hospital security brief told them credible concern, no specifics. She's not happy. She's asking questions. I told her maintenance issue at your building. She doesn't believe me. Elena looked at the message. Despite everything, the ribs, the wrist, the blood, the drive in her other hand, she felt something release slightly in her chest. She typed back. Tell her I'll call Sunday. Tell her to stay inside. Gregor replied in under 30 seconds. She said, Elena always says everything is fine right before it isn't. I'm paraphrasing. Elena stared at that for a moment. Then she put the phone in her pocket. Maya knew her better than anyone. That had always been the problem, and also the only thing that had ever reliably felt like home. Damien came into the kitchen. Contact established, he said. Transfer point in 2 hours. Downtown location, public enough to be safe. Who else knows about the transfer point? The journalist. Me. Now you. Victor. Damien looked at Victor, visible through the kitchen doorway, still staring at his coffee. Victor knows there's a transfer. He doesn't know where. Elena nodded. Costa will be moving, she said. He can't let the drive leave his reach. He knows you left the estate. He'll be trying to reestablish surveillance on your known associates, your vehicles, your phone. I left my phone at the estate, Damien said. In the secure room. She looked at him. Did you? Deliberately. A pause. And the car we're in has no GPS module. I had it removed when I acquired it. She absorbed this. The specificity of it. The years-long preparation for a scenario he must have always understood was possible. A man who had built his empire knowing that the people most likely to threaten it were the ones closest to him. You've been preparing for Costa for a while, she said. He didn't answer immediately. He moved to the window and looked out at the street. The ordinary residential quiet of a Sunday morning, people with dogs, a car backing out of a driveway 2 houses down. My father trusted him completely, he said. Every decision, every expansion, every relationship. Costa was there. Costa was the foundation the whole thing was built on. He paused. I watched my father trust him for 20 years, and I watched what my father's complete trust in anyone did to him. He turned from the window. I decided a long time ago that I would trust nobody without a ceiling. Including Gregor. Including Gregor. Elena looked at him. Including me. He met her eyes. What do you think? She thought about it honestly. I think you're running an operation that requires temporary trust of someone you've known for less than 24 hours. I think you're smart enough to know that's a liability. And I think you've decided the liability is acceptable given the alternative. She paused. Which is close to trust but isn't actually trust. Something moved in his face. No, he said. It isn't. That's fine, she said. I'm not asking for it. The two of them stood in the small kitchen of the unremarkable house on the ordinary street, and outside the window the Sunday morning continued its indifferent routines. And inside the space between them was something that had no clean label but had weight to it, and neither of them reached for a label. 40 minutes later, Victor's phone rang. He looked at the screen and went the color of old paper. "It's a number I don't know," he said. Damien held out his hand. Victor gave him the phone. He accepted the call and held it between himself and Elena so she could hear. The voice was not the flattened, accent-scrubbed voice from the burner call. This was different, younger, male, slightly ragged at the edges, in the way of someone who has been awake too long or is managing a specific kind of fear. "My name is Alexei," the voice said. Victor made a sound that he immediately suppressed. "I'm supposed to tell you," Alexei said. And underneath the controlled delivery, Elena could hear the scaffolding of it, the way he was reading something or had memorized something and was fighting to keep his voice level. "That the terms have changed. The drive for me isn't the arrangement anymore." Damien said nothing. "They want you," Alexei said, "in exchange for me. My father already agreed." Damien looked at Victor. Victor's face was a wreckage. Damien, I didn't agree to anything. I don't know what—" "Victor." Flat. Final. "Stop." Victor stopped. "Alexei," Damien said into the phone. "Are you hurt?" A pause. "No." "Are you in the same place you've been?" Another pause. Longer. Elena heard faintly something in the background, the quality of ambient sound that suggested industrial space, high ceilings, concrete, some kind of air circulation. "I don't know where I am," Alexei said. "That's all right. You don't need to." Damien's voice had shifted into something Elena hadn't heard from him before. Not soft exactly, but less armored. "I want you to listen to me. I'm going to come get you. That's what's going to happen. Do you understand?" Silence. "Alexei." "They said—" "I know what they said. I want you to hear what I'm saying." A pause. "Trust me." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Alexei said, in a voice that was younger than everything else about the call, "Okay." The line went dead. Damien set the phone on the table. He stood with both hands braced on the table surface and looked at the floor, and Elena watched him do something she recognized, the internal reorganization of a person who has just had their primary objective overwritten by a secondary one they didn't account for. "The drive," he said. He didn't look up. "What about it?" "Costa wants me in exchange for the boy, which means he's abandoned the drive as a primary objective." He looked up. "Which means the drive isn't leverage anymore, it's just evidence." "Then we use it as evidence," Elena said. "The transfer still has to happen, but now we have a window." He straightened up. "He's waiting for me to respond to the offer. He expects me to take time, to calculate, to try to find a third option. That gives us—" "An hour," Elena said. "Maybe 90 minutes before he adjusts." "Yes." "We find Alexei in that window." "We find Alexei in that window." She looked at him. The industrial space. In the background of the call. High ceilings, concrete, active air circulation. It's not a residential property. "No." "Costa has a processing facility. East side, isn't it? I heard the address once. I was cleaning the hallway outside a meeting I wasn't supposed to hear." Damien went very still. "I don't know the street number," she said, "but I know the cross streets, and I know it's on the east side because someone mentioned the bridge." I was looking at her with the expression she'd seen a few times now, the one that recalibrated something, that updated a file. "Hartley and 6th, he said slowly. "The old textile building. I can't confirm it, but it fits." Damien looked at Victor. "Is that where they would take him?" Victor pressed his hands over his face. Then he lowered them. "Yes," he said. "It's where Costa operates when he doesn't want a location traced back to the organization. It's been his for years. I didn't think— I assumed Damien knew." "I didn't know," Damien said. He said it without blame and without surprise, which was somehow worse than either. He looked at Elena. 2 hours to the transfer point, he said. 1 hour to Hartley and 6th. He did the math she could see him doing. "We can't do both." "One of us can," she said. He shook his head. "I'm not sending you into a building where Costa has—" "You're not sending me anywhere," she said. "I'm proposing a division of resources. You take the drive to the transfer point. Victor goes with you. He's not useful in a physical situation, and he's a liability alone. I go to Hartley and 6th. With what backup?" Gregor. Gregor is at the hospital. Then call him off the hospital. Maya is in a secure location inside the building with security briefed. She's safer than I am right now, and she doesn't need a dedicated escort anymore. She held his gaze. Gregor meets me at Hartley and 6th. Two people who know what we're doing against whatever Costa left behind to watch a 17-year-old boy. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a dog barked twice on the street. Somewhere farther away, a car horn. The ordinary Sunday sounds of a world that had no idea what was being decided in the kitchen of an unremarkable house. If it goes wrong, he said. Then it goes wrong, she said. Elena, call Gregor. He held her gaze for another second, 2 seconds. Then he reached for Victor's phone. Gregor picked up on the second ring, and Damien spoke to him in Russian for approximately 90 seconds while Elena stood at the window and watched the street and felt her ribs and thought about the building at Hartley and 6th. The dimensions she'd need, the layout she didn't have, the number of Costa's people she couldn't know. She thought about a 17-year-old boy who had answered the phone in a voice that was trying to be older than it was. She thought about what it would have meant at 17 to hear someone say, "I'm going to come get you," and actually mean it. She turned from the window. Damien had lowered the phone. Gregor will be there in 22 minutes, he said. 22 minutes, she repeated. He looked at her. And this time the look was different from all the previous ones. Less calculation in it, less tactical accounting, more of whatever lived underneath that, in the place that the armor was designed to protect. Be careful, he said. It was a simple sentence. 3 words. The kind of thing that people said to each other all the time without meaning it. He meant it. She looked at him for a moment. Go make your transfer, she said. She picked up the drive from the kitchen table and held it out to him. He took it. Their fingers touched this time, briefly, the contact of a handoff, nothing more, and she felt him hold still for half a second before he stepped back. She walked to the front door of the unremarkable house. She opened it onto the ordinary Sunday morning, and she walked out toward Hartley and 6th and the industrial building at the end of it and the 17-year-old boy she'd never met, and whatever number of Costa's people stood between her and getting him out, with 22 minutes to wait, and a body that was running on the last margin of what she could reasonably ask Gregor arrived in 19 minutes, not 22. Elena was standing on the corner of Hartley and 6th when his car came around the block, a different vehicle from anything she'd seen at the estate, a gray pickup truck with rust along the wheel wells that looked like it belonged to someone who used trucks for actual work. He pulled to the curb, and she got in without ceremony. He looked at her, at the state of her face, her arm, the way she was sitting. How bad, he said. Functional, she said. Tell me about the building. Gregor pulled away from the curb and drove past the intersection slowly, not stopping, giving her the angle. The old textile building occupied most of the block. 5 stories. Brick that had gone from red to brown over decades of weather, windows on the upper floors covered from the inside with something that blocked light. The ground floor entrance was a loading dock with a roll-up door currently closed, a standard door beside it, a security camera above the standard door positioned to cover the approach. One camera she could see, which meant there were others she couldn't. Exits, she said. Loading dock, standard door front, fire escape on the north face. I drove the block before I picked you up. The stairs are down, which means someone's been using them recently, or they were lowered deliberately. He paused. There's a basement-level window on the south side. Barred, but the bars looked recent. New hardware on old brick. Recent bars on a basement window, she said. Yes. She thought about a 17-year-old boy. About the air circulation she'd heard through the phone. High ceilings, concrete. Ground floor or basement, not upper floors. How many people does Costa run with on an operation like this? She said. Light footprint when he can manage it. He's been operating parallel to Damien's organization, not inside it. He's been careful not to bring too many of his people into direct contact with Damien's people, which means he's been working lean. Gregor paused. 2, maybe 3. Not more. If he'd wanted more, he'd have had to pull from Damien's network and leave a trail. So 3 maximum inside the building, plus whatever he has watching the exterior. 1 on the exterior, I'd estimate. The camera covers the front. He'd want eyes on the fire escape. Gregor glanced at her. What's the plan? Elena looked at the building as they completed the pass and turned the corner. She held the image in her mind, the brick, the loading dock, The camera angle, the north face fire escape, the south side basement window with new bars. The bars, she said. New hardware on old brick. How new? Weeks, maybe less. Installed from the outside or the inside. Gregor thought about it. Outside. The heads were facing out. Elena nodded slowly. They installed them to keep someone in, not to keep someone out. She looked at her hands. Left hand, functional. Right hand, splinted and limited to blunt applications. They put them on from the outside, which means the mounting hardware faces out, which means the anchor bolts are accessible from outside the building. Gregor was quiet for a moment. You'd need a socket wrench, or something that functions like one. She looked at the rust along his wheel wells. Tell me you have tools in this truck. He reached behind the seat without looking and pulled out a canvas roll, set it on the seat between them. She unrolled it one-handed. Combination wrenches. A socket set, partial. A pry bar. A flashlight. She looked at the socket set, found the right size by eye, the way you learn to estimate by working with your hands, by spending years in rooms where the tools were never exactly right, and you made do. South wall, she said, while you handle the front. Gregor looked at her. I'm not going to tell you it's a good plan, she said. It's the plan we have. He was quiet for a second. Damien's going to be unhappy about the part where you go through a basement window alone. Damien's making a transfer across town. His vote isn't in yet. Gregor almost smiled. It didn't fully form, but it was close. He pulled the truck to the south side of the block and cut the engine. 4 minutes, he said. Then I go to the front. 4 minutes, she agreed. She took the socket wrench and the pry bar and got out of the truck. The south wall was in the shadow of the building next door. A narrow service alley, barely wide enough for a delivery vehicle, that smelled of old water and rust. Elena moved along the wall with her left shoulder brushing the brick, the way she'd moved through the dark corridors of the estate on the night this had all started, and she found the window in the second third of the wall, lower than ground level, the top of the frame at her knee, set into a recess that held the cold like a container. New bars. Galvanized steel, 4 of them horizontal, mounted into the brick with anchor bolts the size of her thumb. She got down on one knee, the right one, which was less damaged than the left, and fitted the socket wrench to the first bolt. Her right hand couldn't grip properly through the splint. She used her left hand on the wrench and her right forearm to brace the pressure, and it was slow and awkward and cost her something in the ribs every time she applied torque, but the bolts were new and the threads were clean and they moved. First bolt, 30 seconds. Second bolt. The angle was worse and she had to reposition, dropping lower, getting her face level with the window glass, and through the glass she could see the interior of the basement. Dim, concrete walls, a support column, the far edge of what appeared to be a cot. A shape on the cot. She stopped breathing for a moment. The shape moved, pulled itself upright and looked toward the window, and in the dim light she could see a face, young, male, with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting in a room for a long time and has learned to be very still. He saw her. She put one finger to her lips. He didn't move. He understood. She went back to the bolts. Third bolt. Her wrist was past its capacity, and she was using forearm and shoulder to compensate, and the ribs were having a sustained conversation with her that she was declining to participate in. The bolt came loose and she caught it before it hit the concrete. Fourth bolt. She heard faintly the sound of Gregor's voice from the front of the building, raised, deliberate, the sound of someone creating a distraction with intent. She didn't know what he was saying. She was past the point where it mattered. The last bolt came free. She gripped the bar assembly and pulled. It was heavier than it looked, solid steel, properly mounted even if hastily, and she had to use both hands and brace her feet against the base of the wall. And when it came free, it came all at once, and she went backward with it, and the impact on her back knocked the remaining air out of her. She lay on the alley floor for 2 seconds. Then she rolled to her knees, set the bars aside, and looked at the window. Old glass. Single pane. She hit it once with the pry bar, carefully, covering the break with her arm to control the noise, and cleared the edges with 3 deliberate passes. She went through head first. The basement floor was 8 feet below the window. She managed it by going feet first after all, hanging from the window frame by her left hand and dropping, controlled as she could make it, bending her knees on impact and rolling to distribute it. and the roll took her across concrete, and she came up on one knee and stayed there for a moment while her body completed its complaint. The boy was on his feet. He'd stood up from the cot when she came through the window, and he was pressed against the wall beside the column. Not cowering, she noticed, just using the column as cover, which was an instinct that spoke to some practical intelligence operating under pressure. She looked at him. 17. Dark-haired like his father. Taller than she'd expected. Victor's height, which was considerable. He was wearing the clothes he'd been taken in, now several weeks old, and he was thin in the way of someone who had been fed but not well. His wrists had marks on them from restraints that were no longer present, which meant they'd trusted the bars over the window to do the work. "Alexei," she said. "Yes." His voice was steadier in person than it had been on the phone. "I'm Elena. I work with Damien." She stood up. "Your father sent me." Something moved through his face at that. Something complicated, involving relief and anger in a proportion she didn't try to calculate. "Is he... He's safe. We have to move right now." She looked at the ceiling. Concrete. One overhead light. A door at the top of a short staircase on the far wall. She could hear, above them, the muffled quality of voices. One voice, which meant Gregor had pulled at least one person to the front. "That door. Is it locked from outside?" "Yes, they lock it when they leave." "When did they last check on you?" He thought about it. 2 hours ago, maybe a little more." "How many people have you seen?" "Two. One stays outside, one checks on me." Which accounted for what Gregor had at the front, which meant the inside was, for the moment, clear. "Window," she said. "Same way I came in." She went to the window first, got her hands on the sill, and looked at him. He was taller than her, longer reach. "Hands first," she said. "I'll push from below." He went without argument, which she appreciated. He was strong despite the weeks. The kind of structural strength that came from being 17 and hadn't been fully eroded yet. He got his arms through the window frame, and she got her left hand under his foot and pushed, and he went through cleanly, and she heard him land in the alley above. She looked at the window. 8 feet up, no cot close enough. Nothing in the room she could stand on except the support column, which was round and offered no purchase. She looked at the wall beside the window. Old brick. Mortar lines deep enough that in some places, where the building had settled, they were eroded half an inch or more. She had climbed worse things in worse condition. She started up the wall. It cost her. Every handhold was a negotiation between her damaged wrist and the need for grip, and the ribs made the extension required by each upward reach into a specific sustained punishment. She didn't count the cost. She made each move and moved to the next one and didn't look down. Alexei's hand appeared at the window frame, extended down toward her. She was close enough. She reached up with her left hand and took it, and he pulled. He was strong, actually strong, not trying hard strong, but genuinely capable. And she came through the window frame and into the alley, and they both ended up on the concrete for a moment, breathing hard. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Can you run?" she said. "Yes." "Then run." They came around the south side of the building at the same moment that Gregor came around the north side, and the three of them converged at the gray truck with the kind of wordless efficiency that existed between people who were all running toward the same exit. The sound of a door opening behind them. The front of the building. Someone coming through it. Gregor had the truck running before Elena's door closed. She heard a shout behind them. Then nothing, because Gregor was already accelerating and the block was already behind them, and the ordinary Sunday streets of the east side were absorbing the truck into their indifferent traffic. Alexei sat in the back seat and breathed. Gregor looked in the rear-view mirror at him. "You all right?" Alexei looked at the back of Gregor's head. "Yeah," he said. His voice was careful, the voice of someone reassessing what all right meant in the context of the past 3 weeks. "Yeah, I think so." Elena looked out the window. She pressed her left arm against her ribs and felt the inventory of the past 18 hours settling into her like sediment. Everything that had been held in suspension by adrenaline and necessity now beginning to find its level. Her phone buzzed. Damien. A text, not a call. Transfer complete. Drive is out. Where are you? She typed back with one thumb. South side. We have the boy. He's okay. The reply came in under 10 seconds. Where? She looked at Gregor. Where are we going? She said. I know a place, he said. Not connected to anything. Just a place. She typed, Gregor knows. We'll send location when we're clear. 3 dots. Then, Elena. She waited. Thank you. She looked at those 2 words for a moment. Then she put her phone in her pocket. The place Gregor knew was a diner 20 minutes west. The kind of establishment that had been in the same location for 40 years and had survived by being exactly what it was without apology. Formica tables, coffee that was hot and plentiful and made no claims to sophistication. A waitress who had been there long enough that she didn't look twice at the state of the people who came through the door. They took a booth in the back. Alexei ordered everything on the breakfast menu, which Elena registered as a good sign. Gregor drank coffee and watched the door with the professional habit of a man who did it everywhere he sat. Elena wrapped both hands around her mug and let the heat move into her fingers, and didn't order food because her stomach was still running on emergency protocols that hadn't gotten the message yet. 20 minutes later, Damien walked through the door with Victor 2 steps behind him. Victor saw his son across the diner and stopped moving entirely. He just stood there in the doorway for a moment, a man who had carried a specific terrible weight for 3 weeks and was now watching it be set down. And his face did something that Elena looked away from because it felt too private to witness directly. Alexei stood up from the booth. Victor crossed the diner in about 4 steps and put his arms around his son, and neither of them said anything, and Elena looked at her coffee mug and Gregor looked at the door and Damien looked at the floor. After a moment, Damien came to the booth and sat down across from Elena. He looked at her. A long, complete look, taking in everything the past several hours had done to the surface of her. The building, he said, handled. Gregor told me what you did, the bars on the window. It was the fastest option. Elena. He said her name with a weight to it that he hadn't used the first time he'd said it, in the corridor of his estate when he'd been memorizing something he should have known earlier. This was different. This was a name he already knew, being said by someone who understood what it belonged to. You went into that building alone. Gregor was at the front. You went into that building alone with cracked ribs and a damaged wrist to pull a boy you'd never met out of a basement window. She looked at him. The drive transferred successfully. Yes. And Costa. Damien was quiet for a moment. He'll surface. The material on the drive is going through verification now. The journalist is working with a legal team and a separate security source to authenticate it before anything goes public. When it does go public, the organizations Costa built his alliances with are going to have larger problems than supporting his play for my operation. He paused. He won't have anywhere to land. That's not the same as stopped. No, it's not. He held her gaze. There are people working on the part that is the same as stopped. People I trust to handle it correctly. She understood what he meant and didn't ask him to be more specific. The political connections, she said, on the drive. When it goes public, 3 state officials are going to have a difficult several months, he said. One of them will probably resign before the end of the year. The other 2 will attempt to survive it, which they won't. He paused. There will be staff, aides, people adjacent who get pulled into the radius of it. I can't prevent all of that. No, she said. I tried to make the list of unavoidable damage as short as possible. I know. She looked at her coffee. It's still a list. Yes, he said. It is. He didn't offer justification for it. She had decided, somewhere in the past several hours, that she valued that about him more than she'd expected to. The absence of the need to justify. The willingness to let the weight of a thing stay exactly as heavy as it was. The waitress came and refilled their mugs without asking and left again. Across the diner, Victor and Alexei had settled into the booth next to them. Alexei was eating. Victor was watching him eat with the specific quality of attention of a person who is memorizing something because they spent 3 weeks afraid they might never see it again. They stayed in the diner for 2 hours. Not because it was strategically necessary, because there was nowhere immediately better to be, and because the ordinary warmth of the place, the coffee, the unremarkable noise of other people's Sunday mornings, the way the light came in through the plate glass windows and landed on the formica without drama, was doing something that none of them had the vocabulary to name directly. At some point, Elena ate half a plate of eggs that Gregor ordered for her without asking, and she didn't object to either the ordering or the eating. Alexei told them about the building, the 2 men, the schedule of checks, the window he'd been watching for weeks because it was the only light source in the basement, and he developed a relationship with the quality of daylight through it that he'd have been embarrassed to explain to anyone. He told it plainly, without performing either the fear or the recovery from it. He was his father's son, Elena thought, in the capacity to hold difficult things at a functional distance. He was also 17, and underneath the functional distance she could see the cost of 3 weeks in a concrete room, and she understood that cost would not fully present itself until later, in some ordinary moment when he didn't expect it. Victor listened to his son talk and said very little. When Alexei finished, Victor said, "I'm sorry," in a voice that was doing everything it could to stay level and not entirely succeeding. Alexei looked at his father for a moment. "You didn't make them take me," Alexei said. "They chose to take me because they knew it would work." He paused. "I've thought about it a lot. For 3 weeks, I thought about it a lot." Something in his face. 17, and also somehow older. "It worked. But you fixed it. So." Victor pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment. Then he nodded. Elena looked away from that too. Damien walked her to Gregor's truck when she said she was leaving. The Sunday afternoon had gone gray and thin, the light flat above the buildings, the air carrying the specific edge of a November that was getting serious about itself. She stood beside the passenger door, and her body was delivering a comprehensive summary of the past 18 hours in the kind of language that didn't leave room for argument. "I'll have a doctor come to wherever you're staying tonight," Damien said. "I can manage." "Elena." Not sharp, just certain. "Let the doctor come." She looked at him. "Fine." He nodded. He looked at the street for a moment, at the nothing in particular that occupied the middle distance when people were working out what to say. "The estate is going to be different," he said. "After everything goes public, the structure, the operations, the people, everything is going to have to be rebuilt from a different foundation or not rebuilt at all. I know. I'm going to have to make decisions about what's worth keeping." "I know that too." He looked at her. "What do you want? After all of this, what did you actually want before any of this happened?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not because it was complicated, but because the honest answer was so straightforward that it felt almost insufficient for everything that had happened around it. "A place," she said. "Something I ran myself, small, nothing that needed defending." She paused. "I wanted to stop being someone's background." He was quiet for a moment. "The cafe you mentioned," he said, "when we were in the study. You didn't mention a cafe, but I looked at your file this morning, before the transfer. There was a note from 8 months ago. You'd applied for a small business loan for a commercial space on Aldine Street. It was denied." She looked at him. "You looked at my file." "I run an organization. Looking at files is part of it." He held her gaze. "The denial was a credit history issue, not a viability issue. The space is still available. I checked." Elena stood very still. "I'm not offering you money," he said, "or obligation, or anything that puts you back in the position of owing something to someone with more power than you." He paused, and she could see him choosing the next words with the same care he applied to everything. "I'm offering to correct a specific injustice that I'm in a position to correct, to a specific person who earned it in a way that I will not forget for the rest of my life, with no strings and no claim." The gray November air sat between them. Elena thought about Aldine Street, about the commercial space she'd looked at through the window every time she walked past it, calculating square footage and foot traffic and what she'd put where. The way you think about things you've decided aren't for you, but can't entirely stop thinking about. "No strings," she said. "No strings. And we're... what? After this? What are we?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know," he said, and the fact that he didn't reach for an easy answer, that he let the uncertainty be exactly what it was something she felt in the part of her chest that wasn't broken. "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying to be." She looked at him, at the face she'd learned in the past 18 hours, the specific architecture of it, the way it moved when he was thinking versus when he'd decided, the place behind the eyes that he kept very guarded and that she'd seen open briefly, twice, in the past day. "Ask me something," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "Anything. Something you actually want to know." A pause. He thought about it, genuinely, not performing consideration. "The underground circuit," he said. "You walked away from it. You buried it and took a job cleaning floors. I want to know why. The real reason. Elena looked at the street. Because I was good at it, she said, and I didn't want to be good at it anymore. She paused. When you're good at something that hurts people, even when the people you're hurting have chosen the same arena you chose, you start to become the thing you're good at. You stop being a person who can fight and start being a fighter who also happens to be a person. She looked at him. I wanted to be a person who also happened to be able to fight. That's different. Damien looked at her. Yes, he said quietly. It is. They stood in the gray afternoon, and the traffic on the street moved past them, and somewhere behind them in the diner, Alexei was probably finishing a third plate of food, and Victor was probably watching him, and Gregor was probably watching the door. Sunday, she said. He looked at her. I call my sister every Sunday, she said. I'm going to call her when I leave here, and I'm going to tell her I'm fine, and she's not going to believe me, and I'm going to tell her anyway. She paused. When the cafe opens, if the cafe opens, I'll make sure she knows the address. And me, he said. Not a demand. Not even quite a question. You know Aldine Street, she said. You looked it up. Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the architecture that preceded one. She opened the truck door. Let the doctor come tonight, he said. I said fine. Elena. She looked at him. I'm glad you didn't stay in the bathroom, he said. She held his gaze for one beat. 2. So am I, she said. She got in the truck. Gregor drove without asking where she wanted to go, which meant Damien had told him, which meant Damien had gotten her address from her file, which was something she decided to be irritated about later when she had the energy. She watched the city go past the window. The Sunday afternoon city, with its ordinary human density, people coming out of grocery stores, children on sidewalks, a man walking a dog that was investigating a streetlight with the thoroughness of someone compiling a report. The city that had no idea what had happened inside it in the past 18 hours. The city that would learn some of it in the coming weeks, when certain names surfaced in certain publications, and would process it the way it processed everything, with noise and then quiet, and then the forward movement of people who have their own lives to maintain. She thought about Costa, about the voice without an accent, the manufactured neutrality of someone who had spent years removing identifying markers from himself. About the particular kind of person who could sit inside an organization for 6 years, building trust deliberately, spending it carefully, waiting with that specific patience. He was out there somewhere. The authorities would work on that. The material on the drive would give them leverage she understood to be significant. And Damien had people who were working on the part that authorities couldn't reach. She had made her peace with that calculation. Not easily, but made it. The truck stopped in front of her building. She sat for a moment. Gregor, she said. Yeah. You've been with him a long time. 14 years. She thought about that. About what 14 years inside an organization like Damien's looked like. The accumulation of things witnessed, decisions made, lines approached, and sometimes crossed. The particular loyalty that survived that kind of knowledge. He's going to do what he said, she told him. Dismantle it. He's not saying it to manage the situation. Gregor was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I've been watching him move toward this decision for about 2 years. Tonight just completed it. Elena looked at the building entrance, at the familiar, unremarkable facade of the place she'd made into a life that couldn't be touched, and understood again, as she had understood standing in that alcove with an armed man 10 feet away, that some things only stay untouched as long as you stay small. She didn't know yet whether she was ready to stop being small. She suspected the answer was already in the past 18 hours, if she was honest about reading it. She got out of the truck. Elena, Gregor said through the window. She turned. What you did, he said. In the building. For the boy. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who did not offer words he didn't mean. That was something. She looked at him. Get some sleep, Gregor, she said. She walked into her building. Maya called at 6:17 in the evening, which was not Sunday call time, which meant she'd been sitting on it all day and had finally run out of patience. Elena answered on the second ring. The maintenance story, Maya said, without preamble, was extremely bad. I know. Gregor, whoever that is, has the specific energy of someone who is very good at exactly one thing, and that one thing is not lying to doctors. He's a bodyguard. A silence. Elena. I'm home. I'm fine. I have a doctor coming tonight for the ribs. Another silence. Longer. How bad are the ribs? Maya said. 2 or 3 cracked. The wrist is minor. Everything else is... Elena. How bad? She sat down on her couch. The sitting down was more complicated than it should have been, and she let it be complicated and let the sound of her sister's voice do what it had always done, locate her, the way a signal finds a receiver. It was a bad night, she said, and a bad day. But it's done. What does done mean? Elena looked at her apartment. The small, careful space she'd built to be exactly what she needed. Nothing decorative that wasn't functional, nothing present that she hadn't chosen deliberately. The apartment of a person who had learned to take up exactly the space she required and not 1 inch more. It means I'm sitting on my couch, she said, and I'm talking to you, and I have a doctor coming, and tomorrow I'm going to look at a commercial space on Aldine Street. She paused. That's what done means. Maya was quiet for a moment. Aldine Street, she said slowly. Isn't that the one you used to walk past? Yes. The cafe space. Yes. Another silence. A different kind. The silence of a person. Recalibrating, updating the version of her sister she carried in her head. Okay, Maya said finally. Okay? I want the full story eventually. Not tonight because you sound like a person who needs to sleep, but eventually. Eventually, Elena agreed. And Elena. Yeah. Next time something happens, Maya paused. I know you're going to say nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen. Right. But if it does, you call me. You don't let some bodyguard tell me it's a maintenance issue. You call me. Elena looked at the ceiling. She thought about being 17 and Maya being 11, and the specific arithmetic of a childhood that had asked them both to be older than they were. She thought about every decision she'd made in the years since then to keep Maya insulated from the harder versions of who Elena had had to be. She thought about whether that insulation had been protection or just a form of distance she'd called protection because it was easier to manage. I'll call you, she said. Promise. I promise. She heard Maya breathe. The specific breath of someone choosing to accept an answer they're not entirely satisfied with, because the alternative is a fight neither of them has the energy for tonight. Get some sleep, Maya said. Come see me when you're less broken. That might be a few weeks. I have a residency. I'm used to waiting. They said goodbye, and Elena sat in the quiet of her apartment, and outside the window the November evening had settled fully into dark, and the city had turned its lights on. And somewhere across it, Damian Volkov was sitting with whatever remained of the evening and the decisions that the next weeks would require of him. And somewhere Victor was watching his son sleep with the specific vigilance of a parent who has been given something back. And somewhere Costa was in motion, calculating. And somewhere in a law office, a journalist was reading through the contents of a small, matty black drive with the focused attention of someone who understood the weight of what they were holding. The doctor came at 8. She was a compact, business-like woman named Dr. Okafor, who had the same quality as the estate's Oleg, the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent her career treating people who had been in places they probably shouldn't have been. She examined Elena's ribs with the same 2-fingered press, confirmed 3 cracked, wrapped them with the clean authority of someone for whom this was a Tuesday, and looked at the wrist. Hairline fracture, she said. The splint is correct. 4 to 6 weeks. 3. Dr. Okafor looked at her over the rims of her glasses. 4 to 6 weeks, she repeated, with the tone of a woman who had also heard that particular counteroffer from 100 different people and had the same feelings about it as Oleg. She left medication and instructions and a follow-up appointment and was gone in under 30 minutes. Elena lay on her couch in the quiet afterward, with the medication beginning to do its work at the edges of the pain and the city outside the window doing what cities do at night. Its continuous low-grade hum of 8 million separate lives maintaining themselves, and she let the past 18 hours settle into her the way sediment settles slowly, finding its final level. She thought about the moment she'd stepped out of the alcove, the specific, irreversible quality of it, the way it had not felt in the moment, like a decision so much as a disclosure, like the truth of something she'd been carrying surfacing because the circumstances had finally created enough pressure. She thought about the drive, about it existing now in the world outside the vault, outside the estate, outside the tight closed circuit of Damien's organization, doing its slow, complicated, damaging work of exposure. The people who would be hurt by it, who hadn't chosen to be in its radius. The larger damage that wouldn't happen because it existed. The math she'd made her peace with, imperfect and real. She thought about Aldine Street, about the commercial space, the square footage she'd calculated standing on the sidewalk outside it in the early mornings when she was walking to the estate for her shift, the light from the front windows at different hours, the kitchen layout she'd redesigned in her head 17 times. She thought about what Damien had said. No strings. No claim. She thought about his face when he'd said it, the specific effort of a man who was offering something without attaching anything to it because he understood, for possibly the first time in his adult life, that the offering mattered more than what came back from it. She didn't know what came next with him. She had been honest about that, and he had been honest back, and neither of them had tried to resolve it into something cleaner than it was. That felt like the right foundation for whatever it turned out to be. She closed her eyes. Outside, the city continued. Cars. Wind across the gap between buildings. Somewhere 2 floors up, a television. The buildings settling around her the way old buildings did, with the particular language of structure finding its rest at the end of the day. Elena Cross, who had spent 2 years being invisible, who had stepped out of an alcove with a scrub brush and a bottle of bleach, and refused, when it came to it, to be furniture anymore. Elena Cross lay on her couch in her carefully chosen apartment and felt the specific weight of a person who has been through the worst of something and is now, provisionally, on the other side. Not clean, not resolved into something simple, but on the other side. The medication pulled her down gently, and she let it, and the last thing she thought before she was fully under was Aldine Street in the early morning. The light through those front windows, the empty space behind them, all that possible quiet waiting to be filled with something that was entirely and only hers. She slept.